On the night of April 3, 1945, Joseph Stalin stood before a wall map in Moscow. Beside him, Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev watched as the Soviet leader traced a boundary line with his pencil. The line ran northward through Poland, crossed into Germany, and stopped at Lübben, a town 80 kilometers southeast of Berlin. Stalin said nothing about which marshal would capture the capital. He did not need to. Both men understood the silence. From Lübben forward, the race was open. This ambiguity was architectural. Stalin had already informed Zhukov privately that Berlin belonged to him, that his First Belarusian Front would deliver the main assault. But now, standing before Konev, he blurred the promise. The demarcation line ended precisely where competition could begin. Konev would later claim Stalin granted him complete freedom of action toward Berlin once the boundary terminated. Zhukov believed he possessed an ironclad guarantee. Both interpretations were simultaneously correct and catastrophically incomplete. Stalin had spent 2 decades perfecting this technique, pitting subordinates against one another, harvesting their ambition for the state's benefit. Speed was his currency, and rivalry paid generous dividends. What neither marshal fully grasped was that their competition would create a trap, not for the Germans defending Berlin, but for the 200,000 souls who would be caught between their converging armies in the pine forests southeast of the capital. 10 days later, on April 14th, Vienna fell to Soviet forces. That same day, Stalin ordered 20 armies, 8,500 aircraft, and 6,300 tanks to pivot toward Berlin. Konev's First Ukrainian Front formed the southern arm of this colossus. His lead formations, Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army and Lelyushenko's 4th Guards Tank Army, began their advance from positions in Silesia, roughly 300 kilometers from Berlin's southern suburbs. The arithmetic of their progress would seal the pocket. Rybalko's tankers covered 25 to 30 kilometers per day on average, with exploitation phases reaching 50 kilometers when German resistance collapsed entirely. On the night of April 17th, his lead elements forded the Spree River in minutes, crushing thin German screening forces and continuing their pursuit through rain-soaked roads. Spring drizzle had turned secondary routes into channels of churned mud, but the main highways remained passable for tracked vehicles. Meanwhile, Zhukov prepared his assault from the east. By April 16th, the two fronts had concentrated 2.5 million men, 6,250 tanks, and 41,600 artillery pieces along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Neisse River. At 3:30 on the morning of April 16th, Zhukov's artillery preparation commenced opposite the Silo Heights, 8,000 guns and mortars delivering roughly 300 tubes per kilometer. German defenders described the opening minutes as a continuous wall of sound that caused temporary deafness and collapsed dugouts across the Oder Valley. By April 22nd, when Konev's tanks linked with Zhukov's forces east of Berlin, the trap had closed. Inside it lay the German Ninth Army, civilian refugees from the eastern territories, and the village of Halbe. General Theodor Busse commanded the Ninth Army from a position that defied all military logic. He was ordered to hold ground that no longer existed, forbidden to retreat from an encirclement already complete, tasked with counterattacking toward a capital he could no longer reach. On April 22nd, as Konev's armor closed from the south and Zhukov's artillery pounded from the east, Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici transmitted a message through General Krebs to Hitler's staff. The Ninth Army must retreat immediately or face total envelopment. The army could no longer move northwest to Berlin. It would have to go around the lake south of the capital. Hitler's response arrived with the clarity of delusion. The Ninth Army would hold Cottbus and establish a front facing west, then attack into the Soviet columns advancing north. This northern pincer, combined with the 4th Panzer Army, would somehow envelop Konev's entire First Ukrainian Front. The order ignored the gap already open between the German armies, the exhaustion of units that had fought without pause since April 16th, and the elementary fact that encircled forces cannot execute pincer movements. By evening, Heinrici secured permission for a relief operation linking Busse's 9th Army with General Walter Wenck's 12th Army advancing from the west. But Busse and Wenck understood what Berlin did not. They planned not a counterattack toward the capital, but a breakout westward toward American lines and the possibility of surrender to forces that might observe Geneva Convention protections. Busse described the plan over crackling radio links. The 9th Army would push west like a caterpillar. Tiger II heavy tanks of the 502nd SS Heavy Panzer Battalion would lead. 9th Army headquarters would follow immediately behind the spearhead. The first attempt would come on April 24th. The SS battalions would clear the path. Their presence would also seal everyone's fate. When Soviet intelligence identified Waffen-SS divisions within the pocket, Nordland, Nederland, the remnants of the 30th Waffen Grenadier Division and the 35th SS Police Grenadier Division, the entire tactical framework transformed. What had been a military encirclement became an extermination zone. The distinction between Wehrmacht conscript and SS volunteer, between 17-year-old Volkssturm militiamen and Foreign Legion fanatic, ceased to exist in Soviet operational planning. Soviet artillery protocols shifted when SS units were confirmed in the Spree Forest. The 1st Guards Breakthrough Artillery Division received new fire mission parameters. Tree-burst shells, designed to explode above ground and rain shrapnel downward through forest canopy, became standard for sectors where SS formations operated. A German survivor later described the effect with clinical precision. It is the artillery which is bringing raining effectively death down from above. It just comes down to effectively dumb luck. The guns did not distinguish. They could not. A Tiger tank flying SS pennants appeared identical to a Wehrmacht Panzer IV in a forward observer's scope. A column moving through pines might contain Nordland veterans or teenage conscripts from Saxony. Soviet gunners treated them identically. Area saturation rather than precision targeting, the mathematics of probability applied to human lives. The contamination was complete. 200,000 people would attempt to break through Soviet lines under a collective sentence pronounced not by their actions, but by their proximity to those who had committed them. Between 150,000 and 200,000 people were trapped when the pocket closed on April 22nd. 30 to 40,000 of them were not soldiers. They were refugees from East Prussia and Silesia. Hundreds of thousands had been fleeing westward since January, staying ahead of the Red Army's advance through the winter snows. They were local villagers from the Spreewald hamlets who had waited too long to evacuate. They were forced foreign laborers whose German employers had abandoned them. By the time Busse ordered the first breakout on April 24th, these civilians had become inseparable from the military columns around them. Their survival strategies locked to the rhythm of Wehrmacht movements through the Spreewald pine forests. Families positioned themselves near recognizable formations, believing organized columns offered better odds of punching through Soviet lines than scattered flight. Refugees discarded furniture, mattresses, and trunks along the forest tracks to keep pace. The roads into Halbe became littered with abandoned possessions and dead draft animals. At night, columns moved by the creak of wagon wheels and muffled orders, civilians following the darker forest paths to avoid Soviet air attack. The smell of sweat and wet wool hung in the cold spring air, breath visible in the chill mornings when temperatures hovered near freezing, and ground mist clung between the tree trunks. Teenaged refugees later described stumbling through undergrowth and darkness, tripping over roots and bodies they could not see, guided only by the glow of distant fires reflecting off low clouds and the irregular flash of artillery illuminating the forest canopy. A 15-year-old girl from near Breslau lost her younger brother when a Katyusha salvo struck the column at a forest junction. In the panic that followed, screaming horses, burning wagons, people diving into drainage ditches, the column fragmented. For 3 days, she wandered the forest alone, moving toward the sound of German voices, away from the mechanical rumble of tracked vehicles that might be Soviet tanks. She drank from forest streams, tasting of peat and pine needles. She ate raw turnips pulled from an abandoned farm cellar. She slept in hollows between tree roots, waking to ground mist that soaked through her coat. The fear was not of death. Death had become ambient, as constant as the distant artillery. The fear was of separation extended into permanence, of dying alone in the forest without anyone knowing where her body lay. The breakout route southwest from Halbe toward Venk's distant lines forced every column through terrain engineered by geology to maximize killing efficiency. The Spreewald marshes formed a labyrinthine region of black water and thick pine forest on sandy soil, so light that foxholes collapsed as soon as they were dug. Men fought and died on the forest floor with no protection except the trees themselves. Those trees became weapons in Soviet hands. Artillery crews deliberately set fuses to burst at treetop height, transforming the pine canopy into a fragmentation device that sent wooden splinters the size of bayonets raining down on columns below. Visibility in the smoke-choked forest dropped to meters. Without sun or stars to navigate by, men moved by compass or followed the sounds of others, often walking in circles back into Soviet positions they had escaped hours before. The smell of burnt resin and wet pine needles mixed with cordite and the copper ammonia tang of spilled blood. A replacement soldier with the remnants of the 712th Infantry Division spent the night of April 28th, waist-deep in marsh water, holding his rifle above his head, while Soviet flares turned the forest canopy into flickering daylight. The drainage ditch had seemed like cover when the Katyusha barrage began. He dove in without thinking, felt the water close over his boots, then his knees, then his waist. The water was black and cold, carrying the smell of decomposing vegetation and the chemical residue of explosives leaching into the groundwater from 1,000 shell impacts. His feet found no bottom, just sucking mud that gripped his boots and pulled with each step. Around him in the darkness, other soldiers had made the same calculation. A flare went up, Soviet, the distinctive slow-falling parachute type, and he froze, watching shadows crystallize into human shapes around him. 15, perhaps 20 men strung along the ditch, their weapons held above their heads, their faces pale ovals in the chemical light. The flare died. The darkness returned. But now the machine guns had registered the ditch, and the first burst came seconds later. A horizontal spray that sent water geysering upward and dropped 3 men in the space of a breath. He pushed forward, each step requiring deliberate effort, his thighs burning with the strain, his lungs aching from the cold that had crept upward from his legs into his core. He reached the western bank near dawn, pulling himself up through reeds that cut his hands like paper edges. Of the soldiers who had entered the ditch with him, perhaps 6 emerged. The rest remained in the black water behind. The wounded presented an impossible equation throughout the breakout. Medical vehicles became priority targets for Soviet artillery zeroed on every choke point. A medical orderly found himself dragging a stretcher through the forest, carrying a 19-year-old private whose left leg had been amputated below the knee 3 days earlier. The stump was infected. He could smell gas gangrene through the bandages, the sweet, rotten odor of bacteria consuming dead tissue and spreading into living flesh. At a creek crossing around midnight, the column halted. The bridge had been destroyed. Soldiers were wading across, the water reaching their chests at the deepest point. He looked at the wounded man on the stretcher, looked at the water, calculated the impossible equation. Carry a stretcher through chest-deep water without drowning both of them. The calculation had only one answer. He administered the last ampule of morphine, watched the wounded man's face relax as the drug took hold, then waded across alone. On the evening of April 25th, Busse ordered Kampfgruppe von Luck and Kampfgruppe Pipkorn, containing the 21st Panzer Division and 35th SS Police Grenadier Division, to smash through toward Baruth. Soviet positions shredded the assault. By morning, 5,000 prisoners had been taken, 40 tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed, almost 200 guns and mortars captured. General von Wiedersheim was captured on April 27th. SS Brigade Führer Fritz Pipkorn was killed. The heavy armor that might have forced open a corridor was gone before the main breakout even began. On the night of April 28th, Busse ordered the mass breakout. Grenadier Martin Klein sat on the 4th Tiger tank in his column, his machine gun ready, watching the formation ahead resemble what he would later describe as a colony of ants weaving its way forwards. The column reached a paved road, allowing faster movement, then crossed a train track. A sign emerged from the darkness: Halbe. The tank swerved around a corner and rolled into the town. The ambush was total. Within seconds, mammoth anti-tank salvos targeted them from all directions. Within minutes, 3 tanks had burst into flames. Klein watched crews squeeze themselves out of narrow hatches, their uniforms burning, their bodies wrapped in flames that turned them into human torches stumbling across the street. His machine gun fell from his grasp. He sought cover behind a tree. The glare of burning armored vehicles silhouetted every German soldier in the street. The attack came from surrounding houses, Soviet infantry who had positioned themselves in second-floor windows and gardens behind stone walls. Klein's group staggered through the town under accurate fire, unable to distinguish officers from enlisted men, unable to make sense of orders being shouted in the chaos. They had no maps, they had no plan, they had no idea how to break out of the pocket. The 50th Guards Rifle Division line broke. A corridor opened westward from Halbe. Soviet armies reinforced the flanks and attacked from the south, concentrating Katyusha rockets and shells on the breakthrough zone. The column that poured through that night stretched 35 kilometers by dawn on April 30th, from Halbe to Luckenwalde, moving through continuous undergrowth and swampy ground dotted with dead horses, smashed carts, scattered equipment, and bodies. In the early morning of May 1st, the remaining survivors crossed the Nieplitz stream and reached the Balitzbruck Road. Approximately 30,000 German soldiers reached the 12th Army and eventually crossed the Elbe to surrender to American forces at Tangermunde between May 4 and 7. Behind them, the forests between Halbe and Baruth held 40,000 dead. The survivors who fell into Soviet hands faced a process that had nothing to do with what they had done and everything to do with who had been beside them when captured. Soviet NKVD procedures, formalized under Beria's Order No. 003.5 of April 18, 1945, mandated internment without investigation for spies, saboteurs, terrorists, and active NSDAP members, a category broad enough to encompass anyone whose papers, tattoos, or unit affiliations suggested proximity to SS formations. The sorting began immediately. Prisoners were stripped. They were examined for the blood-type tattoos worn by SS members on their left upper arms. They were interrogated about their units, their commanders, their activities during the final weeks. Wehrmacht soldiers who had fought in mixed columns alongside Nordlander Nederland faced identical scrutiny as the SS men themselves. The contamination was geographical, not ideological. A soldier captured near Halbe Forest, where SS rearguard positions had concentrated, received classification as interned rather than standard prisoner of war, a bureaucratic distinction that meant deportation to Gulag camps without trial. Proximity to SS units during the moment of capture determined whether a man would see Germany again. At Special Camp No. 7 in Sachsenhausen, 12,000 of 60,000 internees would die from hunger and disease between 1945 and 1950, their sentences determined not by military tribunals, but by administrative protocols that asked only one question: which units were you near when the column was overrun? The civilians who survived the breakout faced identical treatment. Of the 100 to 120,000 non-combatants trapped in the pocket, between 20 and 30,000 died in the crossfire or under deliberate Soviet targeting during the final days of April. The survivors found that their presence in a military encirclement erased every distinction the Geneva Conventions theoretically protected. Geography had determined their fate twice. Once when the dual-front pincer sealed the pocket around them, trapping them in the Spreewald marshes with no escape route that did not lead through Soviet artillery concentrations. And again when their capture location marked them for processing protocols designed to identify SS contamination. The forest had been their executioner. Proximity to SS units had been their prosecutor. And the administrative apparatus of Soviet military justice became their judge, asking only one question that mattered: which units were you near when the column was overrun? In 2022, excavators working on a drainage project near Halbe uncovered skeletal remains tangled in the root systems of pine trees planted after the war. The bodies, Wehrmacht soldiers based on uniform fragments, identity unknown, unit affiliation undetermined, were added to the Halbe Forest Cemetery's ongoing interments. 80 more names for a grave marker that would bear no names. The forest keeps yielding its dead. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.